To understand why John Colter found himself standing naked on a precipice of extinction, we must first look at the silent war for the soul of the American West. In 1809, the frontier was not an empty wilderness. It was a high-stakes chessboard of global commerce. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had technically transferred ownership from France to the United States. But on the ground, this meant nothing to the Blackfeet Confederacy. Historical records from this era show that the Blackfeet, comprising the Piegan, Blood, and Siksika nations, were arguably the most formidable military force on the northern plains. They viewed the arrival of American trappers not as explorers, but as agents of a foreign power arming their mortal enemies, the Crow and the Flathead. Colter was a veteran of the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804 to 1806, a journey that had already left a legacy of tension. When Colter and his partner John Potts paddled their dugout canoe into the heart of the Three Forks, they weren't just hunting beaver, they were walking into a geopolitical meat grinder. The Three Forks, where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers converged to form the Missouri, was a sacred and strategic crossroads. The ecology of 1809 was pristine but unforgiving. The riverbanks were thick with Salix exigua, coyote willow, and massive cottonwoods providing perfect concealment for an ambush. As the two men navigated the Jefferson River, the silence was an illusion. The Blackfeet had been tracking them for miles. The threshold began with a sound, a low rhythmic vibration of the earth that signaled the approach of hundreds of mounted warriors. When the confrontation occurred, it was a clash of two different centuries of warfare. The Blackfeet were master equestrians, utilizing the short bow of the plains, a weapon capable of firing up to 10 aimed arrows in the time it took a frontiersman to reload a single-shot Hawken rifle. Historical data on the Hawken rifle indicates a complex 20-step loading process involving powder horns, linen patches, and lead balls. In the heat of an ambush, this 30-second window was a lifetime. John Potts made a fatal calculation. Gripped by a mix of terror and defiance, he raised his rifle and fired, killing a Blackfeet warrior. The response was a mechanical symphony of violence. Historical accounts suggest Potts was struck by nearly 20 arrows simultaneously. The physics of an 1809 flintlock-era skirmish were brutal. The arrows didn't just pierce, they shattered bone and anchored the victim to the spot. Colter watched as his partner was literally dismantled by projectile fire before his body slumped into the shallow, icy waters of the Jefferson. Colter, however, remained still. This was the vulnerability of the veteran. He understood that in the face of 500 warriors, his only weapon was his composure. He was hauled onto the bank, the cold Montana mud pressing between his toes. It is here that the documentarian must pause to analyze the trial by humiliation. The Blackfeet did not merely capture Colter, they deconstructed him. One by one, his layers of protection were removed. First, his heavy buckskin jacket, treated with animal fats to repel the rain. Then, his flannel shirt, a luxury of the burgeoning industrial trade. Finally, his leggings and moccasins. To a mountain man, moccasins were his connection to the earth. Without them, he was a cripple. The warriors stood in a semicircle, their faces painted with vermilion and charcoal, symbols of war and mourning for their fallen comrade. The air temperature in late autumn Montana frequently hovered just above freezing. Deprived of his clothing, Colter's body immediately began the process of vasoconstriction. To preserve core temperature, his brain signaled the blood vessels in his skin to narrow, shunting warmth toward his heart and lungs. His skin turned a pale, ghostly blue. The specter of the plains was born. The Blackfeet Council debated his execution. Some proposed the gauntlet, where he would be beaten to death by the women and children of the camp. Others suggested he be tied to a tree and used for archery practice. But the chief, a man whose name is lost to time, but whose tactical cruelty remains legendary, saw something in Colter's eyes. He saw a predator. He decided to turn the execution into a ritual of the hunt. The chief led Colter to a vast, open plain that stretched toward the horizon. 5 miles away lay the Madison River, hidden behind a veil of timber. Between Colter and salvation lay a hellscape of Opuntia polyacantha, the starved prickly pear. This cactus is a biological marvel of defense. Its spines are not merely sharp, they are barbed at a microscopic level. When they enter human skin, the barbs lock into the dermal tissue, making extraction an agonizing process that often leads to infection. Colter was told to run. At this moment, we must analyze the biomechanics of the barefoot sprint. A man of Colter's stature, roughly 5'10" and 175 lbs, running on flat, clear ground, can maintain a pace of 10 to 12 miles per hour. However, on a surface of volcanic rock and cactus, his gait had to change. He couldn't land on his heels, he had to stay on the balls of his feet, increasing the strain on his Achilles tendons and calves by nearly 40%. As the signal was given, a roar went up from the 500 warriors. The youngest and fastest among them, the runners, discarded their heavy robes and took up their spears. They were the apex predators of the plains, trained from birth to run down bison and elk. Colter had a 300-yard head start, but he was running against the wind, naked, with his feet being shredded by every stride. 3 miles into the run, the human body begins to undergo metabolic acidosis. As Colter's muscles burned through their glycogen stores, lactic acid began to accumulate in his bloodstream, turning his muscles into lead. His breathing became a series of ragged, wet gasps. This is a condition known as exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, where the pressure in the lungs' capillaries becomes so great that red blood cells leak into the air sacs. Blood began to stream from his nose and mouth, splattering across his bare chest and the dusty ground. Yet, he did not stop. Historical analysis of survival psychology suggests that Colter had entered a state of dissociative fugue. He was no longer aware of the pain in his feet, which were now raw, bleeding masses of flesh and cactus needles. He was focused on a single point on the horizon, the dark line of trees that marked the Madison River. Behind him, the sound of the pursuit had thinned. Most of the warriors had fallen back, unable or unwilling to match his suicidal pace. But one warrior remained. He was less than 100 yards away, his spear held level, his breathing rhythmic and controlled. He was the angel of death in this historical drama. The ground under Colter began to slope downward. The river was close, but his heart was failing. His vision began to tunnel, a sign of extreme cerebral hypoxia. The world was shrinking to a single path of blood and dust. He was at the crucial threshold, the exact point where the human will to live either triumphs over biology or surrenders to the earth. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? To understand the archive of life, we must look at the silence that followed the scream. After the visceral violence of the sprint and the climactic confrontation with the lone Blackfeet warrior, whom Colter had managed to kill in a desperate, lung-bursting reversal of fortune, the silence of the Montana wilderness became his primary adversary. Historical records from the early 19th century describe the Upper Missouri as a cathedral of indifference. For Colter, now hiding in a literal beaver lodge within the freezing waters of the Madison River, the world had shrunk to the scent of wet fur and the sound of his own decelerating heartbeat. He was submerged in water that, according to hydrological data for late autumn, would have hovered between 38 degrees and 42 degrees. At this temperature, hypothermia is not a possibility, it is a mathematical certainty. The human body loses heat 25 times faster in water than in air. Colter was performing a feat of biological defiance. He remained motionless for hours, his head tucked into a pocket of stale air inside the mud and stick fortress of the beavers, while the war parties searched the banks above. This is the history of the everyday in its most extreme form, the minute-by-minute struggle to keep the pilot light of the soul from being extinguished by the elements. When the sun finally dipped below the Bitterroot Mountains, Colter emerged. He was naked, his skin shredded, his feet a pulp of cactus spines and infection, In the 1800s, there were no antibiotics, no synthetic fabrics, and no maps. He was 300 miles from Manuel Lisa's fort at the mouth of the Big Horn River. To document this journey, we must examine the tools of the ghost. Colter had nothing. He had to rely on primitive technology that predated the Iron Age. The fire. Without a flint and steel, Colter could not risk the caloric expenditure of a friction fire, the hand drill method. Every movement cost him precious kilocalories he didn't have. He traveled in the dark, using the stars, the North Star, Polaris, and the Great Bear, Ursa Major, as his only navigational instruments. The clothing. He found a discarded sheepskin or a scrap of hide. Accounts vary, which he used to wrap his torso. But for the most part, he was exposed. The thermal regulation of the human body requires roughly 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day just to maintain a base temperature in these conditions. Colter was operating on a massive deficit. Historical documentation of mountain man journals, such as those of Osborne Russell or Jedediah Smith, gives us a glimpse into what Colter likely ate to stay alive. This wasn't hunting, it was gathering in its most desperate form. He sought out the Soralia esculenta, commonly known as the prairie turnip or timpsila. This was a staple of the Plains Indians. It is a starchy, tuberous root that provides slow-burning carbohydrates. Colter would have had to dig these out of the freezing earth with his bare fingernails, as he had no knife. He also likely consumed inner bark, cambium, from willow and cottonwood trees. While barely digestible, the inner bark contains salicylic acid, the primary ingredient in modern aspirin. This was his only medicine for the excruciating pain in his feet. We are looking at a man who was literally eating the forest to dull the pain of the forest. The trek took him across the Yellowstone Plateau. At this point, we must address the historical myth-making of Colter's journey. It is believed that during this 11-day odyssey, Colter became the first person of European descent to witness the geothermal wonders of what is now Yellowstone National Park. In the archives of the era, this became known as Colter's Hell. Imagine a man, starving and delirious, stumbling upon the roaring mountain or the mud volcanoes. To a 19th century mind, the sight of water exploding from the earth and the smell of sulfur, brimstone, was not a geological curiosity, it was a theological omen. He walked through landscapes that looked like the throat of a volcano, his bare feet treading on earth that was literally boiling beneath the crust. The geological reality of 1809 meant that the crust in certain areas of the Norris Geyser Basin was thin enough to break. Colter was navigating a literal minefield of boiling acid and steam. The documentarian must note the irony. The very volcanic activity that made the land hellish also provided the only warmth he had. He likely slept near the thermal vents to keep from freezing to death during the sub-zero nights. By day 6, the human brain begins to undergo cognitive dissociation due to lack of protein and fats. The Archive of Life records that Colter began to hallucinate. The wind through the lodgepole pines sounded like the voices of his fallen comrades. The psychological isolation of the frontier is a weight that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. In 1809, if you died in the wilderness, you simply ceased to exist. There were no satellites, no rescue parties, no digital footprints. Colter was a living archive. Every scar on his body told the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition, of the Teton Mountains, and now of the Blackfeet. He carried the map of the West in his head, and if he died, that map died with him. His resilience was fueled by a singular professional pride. He refused to let the wilderness win. His physical state was catastrophic. His weight would have dropped by 15 to 20 pounds in less than 2 weeks. His ribs were visible, his eyes sunken into his skull, a condition known as enophthalmos, caused by severe dehydration. Yet historical accounts from the men at Fort Raymond, Manuel Lisa's fort, describe a figure appearing on the horizon that didn't look human. He was a specter of the plains, a man who had been stripped of everything and had grown a new skin of mud, blood, and sheer willpower. When Colter finally reached the fort, the sentries didn't recognize him. He was a walking corpse. He didn't ask for water first, he asked for a knife. The first thing he did was begin to cut the hundreds of black, festering cactus spines out of his feet. This moment in 1809 marks a transition in the American consciousness. Colter's survival proved that the untamed West could be endured, but only by those willing to sacrifice their very humanity to the land. He had become part of the geography. To understand Colter is to understand that the archive of life isn't found in books. It's written in the scars of those who refused to die. In 1809, the psychological landscape of the American West was as uncharted as its geography. To be alone in the modern world is a relative term. It usually implies a temporary lack of digital or social contact. But for John Colter, isolation was an absolute, crushing physical weight. Historical records and journals from the fur-trapping era, such as those by Osborne Russell, frequently speak of the mountain fever, a term that described not just physical illness, but a specific type of madness brought on by the terrifying scale of the wilderness. Colter was navigating what would become the 109th meridian west. At this point in history, there were no settlements, no trails, and no hope of an accidental encounter with a friendly party. This is what psychologists call environmental displacement. When a human is stripped of their tools, clothing, and companions, the brain loses its anchors. The silence of the Madison River Valley wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a presence. The auditory cortex, starved for the sounds of human speech or the clink of metal, begins to amplify the mundane. The grinding of tectonic plates, the distant snap of a frozen branch, or the rhythmic thrumming of blood in the ears. Human beings are, by evolutionary design, social animals. Our survival is predicated on the group. When Colter was cast out naked into the wild, his brain entered a state of hypervigilance. In this state, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, takes complete control of the cognitive process. Historical analysis suggests that by the third or fourth day of his journey, Colter would have experienced a phenomenon known as the third man syndrome. This is a documented psychological occurrence during extreme survival situations where an individual feels a presence accompanying them, a spectral figure that offers encouragement or advice. In the 1800s, this was often interpreted as a religious visitation or a haunting. For Colter, this was the mind's last-ditch effort to prevent total psychological collapse. He was talking to the wind, to the trees, and to the ghosts of the men he had seen die on the trail, simply to keep the linguistic centers of his brain from atrophying. As Colter entered the region we now know as Yellowstone, his psychological isolation took on a theological dimension. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the 19th century frontier. Men of this era were often deeply steeped in biblical allegory. When Colter stumbled upon the Norris Geyser Basin, with its hissing steam vents and the smell of sulfurous acid, his isolation was compounded by a sense of cosmic dread. The technical reality of the Norris Geyser Basin is that it is the hottest, oldest, and most dynamic of Yellowstone's thermal areas. The water temperatures in these vents can reach 200 degrees, and the pH levels are often acidic enough to dissolve leather. To a man in the throes of starvation and sensory deprivation, this wasn't a geological feature. It was evidence of a world in revolt. The psychological isolation turned into a form of solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is sure to exist. Colter began to perceive the landscape as an extension of his own internal agony. The hell he described later to skeptical listeners at the forts was not just a description of the geology, it was a description of his mental state. He was a man who believed he had walked out of the world of the living and into a purgatory designed specifically for him. One of the most profound effects of absolute isolation is the loss of circadian rhythm and time perception. Without a watch, And with the sun often obscured by the thick smoke of forest fires or mountain storms, Colter's 11-day journey likely felt like months. In the 1800s, time was measured by milestones: the next meal, the next camp, the next conversation. Without these, the brain enters a state of temporal dilation. Every minute spent picking cactus needles from his feet felt like an eternity. Historical documents from survivors of similar ordeals, like the Donner Party or the survivors of the Essex, describe how the mind begins to fixate on micro-goals. Colter wasn't thinking about the 300 miles to the fort, he was thinking about the next 10 feet of ground. This fragmentation of the self is a defense mechanism. If he looked at the whole journey, the sheer impossibility of it would have caused him to lie down and die. To provide the technical depth required for this archive, we must address the predatory pressure of the era. In 1809, the grizzly bear population of the northern Rockies was at its peak. These were not the habituated bears of modern parks. These were apex predators that had not yet learned to fear the rifle. The psychological stress of being prey cannot be overstated. Every shadow was a potential Ursus arctos horribilis. Colter was traveling without a weapon, without fire, and without a scent-masking cover. He was a beacon of prey scent to every wolf pack and cougar in the region. The cortisol levels in his blood would have been at toxic levels, leading to muscle wasting and a suppressed immune system. This constant state of fight or flight, without the ability to do either, is what breaks a man. Yet this is where Colter's resilience shines as a historical anomaly. Most men, faced with this level of psychological and environmental pressure, succumb to give-up itis, a clinical condition where the mind simply switches off the will to live. Colter's isolation didn't break him. It forged him into something new. He stopped being a visitor to the West and became a part of its ecology. When we look back at the psychological isolation of John Colter, we see a bridge between the Enlightenment and the raw reality of the frontier. He was a man of the age of reason, thrust into a world of primal chaos. His isolation was a crucible that stripped away the American and left only the human. By the time he sighted the timber of the Bighorn River, he had survived a psychological journey that few in history have ever mapped. He had seen the hell of the earth and the hell of his own mind, and he had walked through both. This phase of his life wasn't just about survival, it was about the terrifying discovery of what remains of a man when the rest of the world is gone. By the 11th day of his journey, John Colter had reached what modern wilderness medicine calls the point of metabolic failure. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look at the forgotten data of 19th century survival. Colter had covered approximately 300 miles of the most rugged terrain on the North American continent. He had transitioned from a high-performance athlete during the 5-mile sprint to a skeletal scavenger. His body was now in a state of autophagy, a biological process where the body, starved of external nutrients, begins to consume its own non-essential tissues to keep the heart and brain functioning. He had lost nearly all subcutaneous fat. His body was now breaking down the protein in his own skeletal muscles. Every step toward Manuel Lisa's fort at the mouth of the Bighorn River was a mechanical miracle. His joints, lacking synovial fluid due to chronic dehydration, would have grated like rusted iron. The breaking point occurred on the final ridge overlooking the confluence of the Yellowstone and Bighorn Rivers. Historical records from the survivors of the Missouri Fur Company described the weather of late 1809 as particularly venomous. A cold front had descended from the north, bringing a black frost that turned the mud into jagged glass. Colter, still largely exposed, was now facing the final stage of systemic shock. As Colter crested the final rise, the site of the wooden palisades of Fort Raymond, also known as Fort Manuel, appeared through the freezing mist. But here, the mind often plays its most cruel trick, remission of will. When a survivor sees the goal, the adrenaline that has kept them upright for days suddenly vanishes, replaced by a wave of exhaustion so profound it can be fatal. Colter's legs gave out. He did not fall. He collapsed like a structure whose foundations had been dynamited. He was less than a mile from the gates, yet he was as far from safety as he had been in the Beaver Lodge. The breaking point was the realization that he could no longer stand. To reach the fort, he would have to crawl. To document this, we must look at the technical reality of the survival crawl. Moving on hands and knees over frozen ground without clothing is an exercise in agony. The friction of the ice against his raw skin would have caused immediate frostnip, transitioning into stage 2 frostbite. His hands, already swollen from digging for roots, began to lose sensation, a terrifying sign that the blood flow had been completely shunted to his core. At the gates of Fort Raymond, the sentries were men hardened by the frontier, men who had seen scalping, starvation, and animal attacks. Yet when they looked out into the grey hour of dawn, they saw something that defied their understanding of the living. Historical accounts from the men stationed at the fort describe a creature emerging from the brush. It was not a man. It was a scabbed and blackened thing. Colter was covered in a thick layer of dried mud, blood, and wood ash, which he had used as a primitive insulation against the wind. His hair was matted with pine resin. His eyes, according to one account, were burning holes in a dead mask. When the gates opened, the breaking point reached its climax. Colter didn't cry out for help. He couldn't. His vocal cords were so dehydrated they had effectively seized. He simply dragged his body across the threshold of the fort and lay still. The men of the Missouri Fur Company moved him to a bunk. Here, we must analyze the dangers of refeeding syndrome, a medical phenomenon unknown in 1809, but one that likely nearly killed Colter. When a person has been starving for 11 days, the sudden introduction of heavy food can cause a massive shift in electrolytes, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium, leading to heart failure or coma. The trappers, acting on instinct, likely fed him boudin, buffalo intestinal sausage, or a thin roux-babou, a broth of pemmican and flour. Colter's system would have revolted. For 48 hours he hovered between life and death, his body shivering so violently that he had to be held down. This was the post-survival crisis, where the nervous system, finally safe, begins to process the massive trauma it has endured. The most visceral part of this breaking point was the physical cleaning of his body. It took hours for the men to wash the filth from his skin, but the true horror lay in his feet. The prickly pear spines, which had been embedded for 11 days, had become part of his flesh. Using only a Green River skinning knife and a pair of sewing needles, his comrades began the agonizing process of extracting the spines. Many had traveled deep into the muscle tissue, causing localized sepsis. Each extraction was a reminder of the 5-mile sprint. They pulled hundreds of needles from the soles of his feet, the heels, and even between his toes. Colter remained conscious for much of this, his resilience of silence becoming a legend within the fort's walls. The breaking point is where the documentary must shift from the physical to the philosophical. Why didn't Colter die? From a technical standpoint, he should have. The caloric deficit, the exposure, the sepsis, and the psychological trauma were a lethal combination. His survival suggests a functional adaptation of the human spirit. He had crossed a line that few humans ever touch, the line where the ego dies and the animal takes over. When he finally spoke, his first words weren't about his pain or his hunger. He spoke of the hell he had seen. The geysers, the steam, the boiling earth. He was already documenting the West before he could even walk again. The breaking point was not the end of John Colter. It was his second birth. He had been stripped naked by the world and had dressed himself in the very fabric of the wilderness. He was no longer just a trapper. He was a monument to the fact that the human body is merely a vessel for an unbreakable will. In the immediate wake of John Colter's return to Fort Raymond, a new conflict began, the war between first-hand experience and academic orthodoxy. To the men at the fort, Colter was a living miracle, but to the cartographers and politicians in St. Louis and Washington, D.C., he was becoming a liability to reason. Didu, Historical records from the early 19th century show that when Colter eventually returned to civilization in 1810, he shared his findings with William Clark, his former commander. Clark was in the process of drafting the definitive map of the West. Based on Colter's descriptions, Clark added a region to the map labeled Colter's Route in 1807, encompassing the 1809 ordeal as well. However, the historical aftermath was defined by a profound lack of belief. When Colter described the Yellowstone caldera, a place where the earth breathed fire and the water turned to steam, the public laughed. They called it Colter's Hell. This term, which we now use as a badge of honor for his discovery, was originally a derisive slur meant to characterize him as a liar or a man whose brain had been cooked by the sun and the Blackfeet. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of scientific skepticism in the 1810s. If a phenomenon did not fit into the Newtonian physics of the time, it was dismissed as Trapper's law. While the world doubted his words, Colter's body was paying the historical debt of his survival. The technical reality of surviving such extreme trauma is that the body never truly recovers. Modern studies on chronic stress and longevity suggest that the level of cortisol and oxidative stress Colter endured during those 11 days likely caused permanent damage to his cardiovascular system. Historical archives indicate that Colter, the man who seemed invincible, died only a few years later in 1813, likely of jaundice or sudden kidney failure, common euphemisms of the time for organ collapse. He was only in his late 30s. The aftermath reveals a sobering truth. Colter didn't just run 5 miles. He traded the last 30 years of his life for those 11 days of survival. The documentary must treat this as a sacrificial archive. He gave his future to preserve the present. To understand why this moment changed the West, we must look at the macro-level economic impact. Colter's ordeal and the death of John Potts signaled the end of the individual trapper era and the beginning of the corporate frontier. The Blackfeet Confederacy had sent a clear message. The Three Forks were closed. Historical data shows that following the Colter incident, fur companies began to move in much larger, more militarized groups. The mountain man evolved from a solitary explorer into a paramilitary contractor. Colter's 5-mile sprint was the catalyst for a decades-long conflict between the Blackfeet and the American Fur Company. The aftermath also forced a shift in indigenous settler relations. Colter had become a legend among the Blackfeet as well, a ghost who could not be killed. This created a psychological deterrent, but also a renewed determination to protect their borders from these unnatural men who could survive barefoot in the cactus. In 1931, over a century after his death, a piece of rhyolite carved into the shape of a human face was found in Idaho, near the end of Colter's suspected route. It bore the inscription, John Colter, 1808. This artifact, known as the Colter Stone, serves as a physical bridge to the historical aftermath. While some historians debate its authenticity, its existence speaks to our human need to find a hard record of an impossible feat. The technical analysis of the stone's weathering suggests it sat in the elements for decades. Whether carved by Colter himself during a moment of rest or by someone later honoring his path, the stone represents the solidification of legend. There is a final subtle layer to the aftermath. By being the first to describe the hell of Yellowstone, Colter unintentionally sowed the seeds for the national park system. His vivid, terrifying descriptions, once mocked, eventually prompted the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition of 1870. When those later explorers finally saw the Old Faithful Geyser and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, they realized Colter hadn't been mad, he had been a witness. The aftermath of his 300-mile crawl was the eventual protection of 2 million acres of wilderness. He was the unintended architect of conservation, a man who found beauty through the lens of absolute agony. Colter was buried in an unmarked grave on a small hill near the Missouri River, which was later disturbed by the construction of a railroad. In the final poetic irony of the historical aftermath, the man who traversed the entire West without a map had his own final resting place erased by the very progress he helped initiate. He left no journals, he left no wealth, he left only the story, a story that was so powerful it survived the ridicule of his peers and the erasure of his body. To document the aftermath of John Colter is to document the birth of the American hero, a man who is defined not by what he conquered, but by what he could endure. To reflect on the legacy of John Colter is to look into the mirror of our own biological heritage. In the modern era, we often view the human body as a fragile vessel, dependent on the exoskeleton of civilization, our shoes, our climate-controlled rooms, and our processed calories. But Colter's 1809 ordeal serves as a biological archive of what the human species is truly capable of when the veneer of the 21st century is stripped away. From a technical standpoint, Colter's survival is studied today by elite military units and ultra-endurance athletes as a case study in metabolic flexibility. He transitioned from a carbohydrate-dependent state to a deep ketogenic state, where his brain fueled itself on the breakdown of his own body fat and eventually his own muscle tissue. This is the legacy of the primal, the realization that the human operating system has a survival mode that most people will never activate. The legacy of John Colter is also the legacy of the American spirit of exploration. Before the satellite and the drone, the world was mapped by the soles of feet. Colter's journey was the ultimate low-tech victory. Historical analysis of the frontier period shows that Colter was the progenitor of the mountain man mystique. He was the first to prove that a European American could not only enter the indigenous sovereign lands of the West, but could go native in terms of survival skills while remaining a sentinel of Western expansion. This duality is his complicated historical footprint. He was both a victim of the wilderness and its greatest champion. The silence that Colter endured for 11 days, the absolute psychological isolation, has become a rarity in our connected world. His legacy teaches us the value of voluntary hardship. In an age of instant gratification, the image of a man picking 300-year-old cactus needles out of his feet is a jarring reminder that honor and resilience are not just words, but physical states of being achieved through sacrifice. If we look at the history of human resilience, Colter stands alongside figures like Shackleton or Saint-Exupéry. He represents the moment where the individual becomes a force of nature. Historical records from the 1880s, long after his death, show that Colter was still being discussed around campfires. To the later pioneers, he wasn't just a man, he was a secular saint of the trail. His story provided the psychological armor for those who followed. If Colter could survive naked and barefoot in the Three Forks, then a family in a covered wagon could survive a winter in the Sierras. He lowered the threshold of the impossible. Perhaps the most profound reflection we can make is on the geography of remembrance. The Madison River still flows through the same valley where Colter ran. The prickly pear still grows there. The Blackfeet Nation still guards its heritage and history. When we visit Yellowstone today, we are walking through Colter's hell. The geysers he was mocked for describing are now the centerpieces of a global heritage site. His legacy is the validation of the witness. He stood in the steam and the sulfur, alone and dying, and he saw a world that was worth surviving for. He reminds us that the truth, no matter how unbelievable, eventually surfaces, just like the boiling water of the Norris Basin. What can the modern viewer take from the archive of Colter? The priority of the mind. Survival is 10% physical and 90% psychological. Colter's feet were destroyed by mile 3, but his mind didn't allow his legs to stop until mile 5. The value of local knowledge. Without his understanding of the Timpsila route or the insulation properties of mud and ash, he would have been a skeleton by day 4. The weight of legend. History is not just a collection of dates. It is a collection of stories that define what we believe we can endure. John Colter died as a humble farmer in Missouri, but he lives on as the specter of the plains. He remains the man who was told to run, and in doing so ran straight into the immortality of the American archive. The story of John Colter is the story of every one of us when we are pushed to our absolute breaking point. It is a reminder that while we may be stripped of our tools, our clothes, and our dignity, we can never be stripped of our will unless we surrender it. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.